So that means that over the next 5 to 10 years, Bitcoin should be worth, $1 million plus, for instance. Not because it's only rising in value, but also because the number of people who want to own one full Bitcoin will see it as that ultimate status symbol. I think the easiest way that I would describe basically Web3 is it is the web of ownership. It means that finally we can own our digital assets and our digital goods and our digital time. We saw blockchain technology, we said, wait a second, this is how we get back to the origins of the internet, which is open. And now in a way in which we can own our digital assets, thereby introducing digital property rights, which is to me the foundation of our freedoms.
Yacht, welcome to the World XP podcast. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the people listening, do you want to do a quick intro, kind of who you are and what you do? And then we'll hop into the question from the last guest, and then we'll jump into the conversation. I'm super excited. You've done a lot of cool things. Your company's doing a lot of cool things. So excited to pick your brain for sure. But the
Yeah,
floor
so
is yours.
quickly, thank you. So quickly, my name is Yat. I'm chairman, co-founder of Animoca Brands. We're a company whose mission is to deliver digital property rights. Therefore, we are in blockchain and in the Web3 space. We have over 600 portfolio companies today. The size and revenues of our business, just to give an indication of scale, last year was over $314 million in revenue with about $97 million EBITDA and about $1.8 billion in digital assets, mostly in fairly liquid sort of tokens and, of course, investments that we've done. And we're known as an investor, although we're not a fund, so we invest out of operating capital. And we generally have a belief that blockchain is going to provide more equity and access for people, specifically financial access, and that the world needs more financial literacy. And we think blockchain and crypto is one of the best ways to do that. So yeah, that's it quickly in a nutshell for us.
Yeah, to be honest, I couldn't agree more. I think the financial landscape has been restructured recently and is currently in the process of being restructured. I had a guy on that quit his job at JP Morgan Chase to kind of do similar things. Instead of, he's not focused so much on blockchain and crypto, but focused on the financial education and financial literacy and things of that nature. So I think a lot of people share that view. And anyway, so the question from the last guest is, what is the best piece of personal or business advice that you have ever received?
Best piece of business advice. Geez. Look, I would say, I don't know if there's such a thing as best piece of business advice, but I would say the mantra that I tend to follow often, and again, I would hesitate to say it's the best, but it's certainly one that we operate under, is that we would, try to be wherever you are, being early. Of course, this makes assumptions that, you're good and capable at it, but being early is always a premium. So when you look at the sort of classic diffusion of innovation chart, when you're able to be early in any industry, whether this is blockchain, whether this is the internet, whether this is mobile, whether whatever, you actually end up having a competitive edge, and you try to sort of find where the blue sky opportunities are because it's new, right? So I would say that's probably an advice that we try to follow, and it's certainly something that we subscribe to.
Very nice. Yeah, agree with that as well. Um, for some context for people listening, do you mind kind of defining Web3 and blockchain and maybe some of the other, like, I understand what they are, but maybe not well enough to explain them to other people. So do you mind kind of defining like Web3 and blockchain specifically, and maybe digital currency as well, or some of the other terms that we might be using frequently throughout the conversation, just to give some context?
Sure, of course. So I would say that, I'm going to sort of zoom out a little bit, and then we can go into the specific use cases where, because most people, when they hear about blockchain and crypto, they think Bitcoin, and that's certainly a key application for it. But I think the easiest way that I would describe basically Web3 is it is the web of ownership. Now, what does that mean? It means that finally we can own our digital assets and our digital goods and our digital time. And how that works is because the data that is now stored, online, is not stored in a centralized system that is owned by someone else, as in, the database of Amazon or Facebook or Google. It is stored in a decentralized network, which is powered by blockchain. And therefore, the blockchain technology makes it possible for us to own basically and have digital property rights because it's decentralized and not owned by any single entity. And also allows you to have self-custody of these assets in the same way that you own your Bitcoin and not some bank or some intermediary owns your Bitcoin. You can own it yourself. You can use the same technology to essentially own your data, the rights to your data, and the ability to monetize that data. That's the framing of it. Now, at its heart, blockchain, the technology that makes this possible, is really just a decentralized ledger. And what that means is a data structure that is basically sort of mirroring, essentially, in simplest terms, an open database that is accessible and available by everyone, but powered by everyone as well. So in Bitcoin, that would be the mining network, but in Ethereum, that would be the staking network. And you can think of it as, when Ethereum describes themselves as like the world's computer, what they mean, it's a composable open platform that you can develop applications on in the form of these smart contracts, but it is not powered by sort of a central sort of server. It is powered basically by everyone contributing to the power of the network. So think of it as a kind of form of distributed computing, if you will, right? So I'm obviously trying to simplify sort of the nature of this. Now, what happens though, and I think this is where often it gets confusing, is that when you have the ability to own your digital assets, in through blockchain, then they become a capital asset because the formation and the foundation of capitalism is property rights, physical property rights.
Hmm.
So when you have the ability to have digital property rights, that means you can now have true digital capitalism. And the point is that there is the capitalistic system we have today, worldwide, is not expressed digitally, natively. It is expressed as a derivative of the digital product, as in I can make money online, but I might own shares in a company to benefit from that, or I might own the IP in the legal framing, but I don't have a way of owning the digital version of that or the attention framing of that. And that's basically what you're now able to do with tokens, for instance, which is a representation of the ownership of these type of digital networks. And I want to give an example to maybe make it a little easier for people who are not familiar with blockchain to think about, which is the most valuable asset we would say is network effects. Now, exactly what does that mean? Because a network effect seems sort of nebulous. Well, the network effect is basically our social graph, and that social graph basically extends into network effects that we can build based on our knowledge. That knowledge gets deeper. It allows foundation of creation of things. Like, for instance, if you look at AI or look at Facebook or these companies, they are basically so the apex network effects, if you will. And we feed them every day with our data when we post stuff on Instagram, when we share images, right? They just get richer and richer with data and value, which make them powerful. And that's basically these endless forms of network effects and the benefits that sort of are created from them, right? That's basically what's so valuable about them. And then they get monetized. The value of that network effect is monetized in the form of advertising. And the advertising industry last year was about $1.1 trillion, of which roughly 80% of that is Apple, Facebook, Google. And guess who are the biggest companies in the world? Oh, they happen to be Apple, Facebook, Google, and the like, right? And that's because we are actually on these digital platforms, such as Instagram, sharing photos, right? Getting virtual likes and follows, which are a form of currency, if you think about it, because
Hmm.
the reputations go, it's a currency, right? Except that currency is not monetizable to us, except to only one party, which is Instagram, as in Facebook, right? So our conjecture is that we are basically living in the digital feudal society and that we're basically serfs. And everyone who's basically posting free photos and Instagram and Facebook think it's free, but nothing ever really is free. You're giving your data, your attention, your social graph, they're building networks and they get more power over time. And now they're the biggest, most powerful, wealthiest, most cash-rich companies in the world. And so what blockchain now does is we can say that data doesn't belong to them, it belongs to you. You have full sovereignty over it. And when you think about something like Bitcoin, which is a store of digital value, regardless of whether you think it's valuable or not, now this is something you can own yourself and the representations around that, right? And so every token that's out there, most of them are representations of basically attention economies. So even a meme coin like a Doge coin, you could say, oh, that seems silly and a joke, but it has attention, right? And what it is a brand. And in the classical financial sort of way, we described it as goodwill, right? So, and goodwill is an asset in your balance sheet, right? Nike, sells shoes, but Nike wouldn't sell as many shoes if it wasn't Nike and the brand value that's attached to it. And because you can attach it to any kind of brand. So that's kind of a kind of intellectual property right? And the value of IP, trademark, patents, which is all virtual, because one of the other criticisms people have around it, but this is virtual. I can't touch it. It's not like an asset like a house or like the gold that might be sitting in your safe. Well, the most valuable asset that is especially that's grown over the last 50 to 100 years is intellectual property rights. And
Yeah.
intellectual property rights is entirely virtual. Right? There's nothing physical per se on it, right? And the most valuable companies all have very, very coveted IP. And that is about $68 trillion in market value, according to WIPO, which is, depending on the day you look at, somewhere between 8 to 10 times the value of gold, right? Which is the most valuable commodity on earth, right? So here we go, right? Virtual property rights are already the most valuable property rights, and this just basically extends it into the other areas through basically tokenization and blockchain. So obviously, there's many more facets to this, but hopefully that gives people a little bit of a lens as to what blockchain and Web3 means to us.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot in that, and I had a couple of thoughts. The point about the brand and the branding, the digital branding, right? Nike wouldn't sell as many shoes if it wasn't Nike, and kind of extrapolating that to each person and the monetization, or I'll say air quotes monetization of likes and comments and other things. It gets to me in a little bit of a strange because you would the thing that went into my brain was social credit score, which is like your personal brand can be monetized by how much people like you, and that feels like that can be manipulated very easily. With that said, it's a whole new ecosystem that's existing, and so if you have, for example, so I guess where were you going with that? Because th those are the thoughts that go into my head on that in
Yeah.
particular, and it feels a little hairy, right? It doesn't feel a bit like dystopian almost, but at the same time, the need to own your own data and own all these things also makes sense. So how do you kind of wrap your head around that? It seems like a little bit of a paradox there.
Okay, so maybe let's unpack that a bit. So first of all, when someone has a lot of follows and likes, right, there is a social score, as you said, and that social score is your reputation. And then the way you monetize that is typically through a derivative. The derivative is, hey, I got 1 million followers. Maybe some brand says, hey, you know what, I want to hire you to make a little post to go to your audience. What you're really doing is you're monetizing, the audience that follows you.
Hmm.
But the difference is on Instagram, for instance, you don't actually know all your followers, right? You have like 1 million followers, maybe that's great. But do you know who your true fans are? Do you know who's actually on your website really 10 times, sort of on your page and interacting with you and 10, 20 times versus someone who's just browsing through? That's kind of the first point. Well, because it pays you and has value, people obviously try to fake and bot it as well, right? And this is where blockchain is
Always.
interesting.
Like you can
Yes,
buy
exactly.
followers and all these other things.
Exactly. And this is why blockchain is interesting because blockchain is, what makes it work so well, the distributed ledger, is it gives you proof of certainty and authenticity. So in other words, the same way that you can't forge your Bitcoin, it's just not forgeable. A lot of people are like, it's just digital currency. No, it's not. Because of blockchain technology, because of the distributed ledger, and because of the cost of the proof, it is absolutely certain that this is your Bitcoin, and everything else would be essentially sort of fake, so to speak, if it wasn't if someone tried to pretend that another Bitcoin. Whereas you could sort of literally sort of print fake money, at least at the surface might look real even if it's not, right? And that's what we're seeing in the social media world today with like sort of likes and follows, because you don't know if it's authentic. Now, if this was backed on blockchain, then you know that it's authentic, at least who voted or who voted on it or who gave it, and that is not. And it's also more importantly that it was voted by people with a certain type of credit as well. So if I'm on X, for instance, and if hypothetically Elon Musk were to follow me, right, then that would give me a lot more cred than 1 million random followers, right,
Hmm.
because of his own reputation. But Elon isn't just going to follow anyone. He's going to follow people that he thinks are interesting to him, and him following that gives a score attached to that as well, right? And that information basically then gives you a kind of ranking and data around sort of the importance of that person that you try to judge and estimate. But also because it's certified because this is the real Elon or this is the real Yat. or this is a real Eric, and he gave a like. And so if I follow him, then immediately that cred bleeds into that as well, because I follow him. So I guess maybe we should take him somewhat seriously, so to speak, right? Or, something along those lines. But the thing is that unless I know Elon or myself or yourself, that ranking in that score doesn't have meaning to, the world that doesn't know us, right? So that means that I'm just a random person to them. And therefore, that's the part where forgery can happen because maybe Elon is hard to forge, but everyone else is because we don't know most of the people around the world. And then you just have these number indicators. So with blockchain, because you have to basically prove, like what you can do with things like proof of humanity, like humanity protocol, you can show that you're human, but you can also show that in the network, it's authentic because of the assets that you own, because it's on blockchain, or because of the time you spent on things that is certified, that you've been there for 5 years or 10 years or whatever that is, right? These are things that you can actually certify and prove that can't be forged because it's basically in the kind of secure decentralized network that is on the blockchain. So that's kind of one version of this. But the second one, and this is quite critical around like digital identity, for instance, and how blockchain is really fascinating there, is that with blockchain I can own my digital identity, in my own wallet, and through zero knowledge proof, which is basically a way in which you can prove something without actually revealing the identity. I don't have to share my name, but I can prove that I am of this stature, right? And because I own the data in my own framework and the reputation, let's call it reputation score attached to that, I don't have to deal with all these privacy laws the same way, because now I'm the custodian of my own data. So why do privacy laws matter? The privacy laws don't matter because of your data that you own yourself. Privacy laws matter because you have the custody of data of others. So, for instance, why does in Europe with GDPR or where elsewhere do you have sort of very complex privacy rules? Because you're collecting data of your customer, and you're not supposed to use it in a certain way, right, without permission. But and sometimes I collect information that I might not need to know, but I have it anyway because you're filling it out. And so therefore, I need some framing that protects the data against abuse and hacks and all that kind of stuff. Which again, if this was done in a way where you could have self-custody of the data, where you could only reveal certain information about what is necessary to be able to use a product and service, enough so the service can operate well without me revealing everything, then I'm more responsible for my data and I'm responsible for my identity. And therefore, you don't need to have these complex privacy sort of rules that guide the large corporates, because essentially they never have your data to begin with. Now, what that means is that a startup who doesn't have the ability to hire all these lawyers and all these sort of security framing can now do that. And this is the key here, because now everyone can start building these frameworks in a public manner that doesn't basically sort of create these sort of financial restrictions. And that's why in Europe, for instance, it's very hard to be a startup that deals with data because it's too costly from a sort of regulatory standpoint. But again, if you use this kind of technology, you don't have that. You don't have that challenge. So that would be sort of one of many examples. But maybe the other example, and again,
Can I pause you
is
real quick?
please go ahead.
Um, the one of the things that popped into my head as you're going through that is identity theft. Is
Hmm.
that so? Like, as we get more, I'm going to ask this question with the assumption that blockchain ends up with mass adoption. But if data starts to become on the blockchain, so for example, Social Security or like government ID, like PII, these sorts of things end up on the blockchain, is that something that would be, right? Because identity theft is a big problem, especially in the digital world when people are not careful, where they click on links and all of a sudden there's malware or whatever in their computer. And you see this with kind of the older generation always oh, the Nigerian prince called me and now I wired some money, right? And like as that's the classic example. And then the scene from The Office where he's like, oh, identity theft is not a joke, Jim, right? But it's a big thing that goes on. Is this something that would help prevent or at least mitigate a big portion of that in the future, under the assumption
Yes,
that it's
I
mass
think so.
adopted?
Yes, I think so. And the reason why is because you can certify who's contacting you, and you can also therefore, in a way, certify who else is attached to that, right? So I'll give you an example. Right now, when someone in the Web2 world wants to prove that they have some cred, they set
Can
up a
you
profile.
define Web 2 real quick before you go on to that,
So sorry.
just for
So
people
web,
listening?
yeah, yeah, Web2, we define Web2, and commonly Web2 is defined as the social web that we live in today. So Web1 was a web of read. So basically, the early days of the internet, you had a web browser, and it was quite sort of like I go there to read stuff. Web 2 was the ability to write to the web, so it became read-write. And by read-write, it opened up the framework for what we now know as the social web. So things like blogs and sort of forums and of course chat groups and so on. And so we started making content, and that's actually how the internet ended up exploding, right? The only difference is that we ended up writing the data to a centralized store where they end up owning sort of that, right? Anyway, what we see here in the Web 2 world, of course, is that we sorry, just the framing of the question was on identity theft, right?
Yes.
Is that when you go to something like LinkedIn, which is a Web 2 platform, right? It doesn't use blockchain technology. You can set up a fake profile of you and me, and in fact, that happens quite frequently. And then, if the fake person follows someone and someone else follows us back and so on, as they end up building up more and more of these followers, in time, the theft starts to work when people who are actually my friends and actually appear to be people that are trustworthy follow that and they sort of cross-follow each other because, it's a profile of sorts. That's when the theft is possible and the damage is possible because as it grows, how do you validate that it's a real me? You look at the rest of the social graph and you say, okay, is he following him? Does he seem right? That kind of stuff. As opposed to basically random people that I don't know, right? That's the foundation of trust, by the way, right? Like when you go and meet someone for the first time and you tend to ask around and say, hey, do you know this guy? Is he trustworthy? Can I do business with him? Whatever that is, right? We try to verify within our network. And what the internet has done is expanded that network to really reduce it to a number, right? Oh, he's got 1 million people following him. I think he must be real. Like, even even if he's not, right? And then of course that means that, and this has happened to me personally a few times, where someone sets up a fake profile of myself, then basically bots up to 500,000 or 1 million users, and then pretends. And then next thing he does, and this is where it's usually the giveaway, comes up with some sappy story and says, "Oh, can you send me some money because I'm kind of stuck here and I'll pay you back." And everyone goes like, "Wait a second, you'd never say that." So fine, right? So that's just one. That's what you know. However, the point is that up until that point, they had basically built up this fake persona because it couldn't be verified. Now with blockchain, your signature is cryptographically secured. So, and the cryptographic security isn't only my own identity, because even if someone stole my identity, everyone else in the network, which is why decentralization works, right? That is cryptographically sort of secured as well, has to also verify my identity. So even if mine happens to be hacked, for instance, because someone took possession of my wallet or, under gunpoint or whatever that might be, right? The rest of the network has to validate you as well. So there's never a single point of failure, right? And that's basically the foundation of, again, what people can see in things in crypto like Ethereum or Bitcoin. Basically, the verification is one that happens throughout the network as others validate who you are or the transaction in this particular case. So that's basically how you can secure against this type of identity theft, at least at starting point, because then and again, most of the kind of hacking that takes place tends to be social engineered and
Yeah.
not sort of technical, right? So what's the best protection against social engineered hacks? More social protection against the people who you know and the framing in which you're in, right? And to me, this is no different than the physical version of what we see in the digital version. Digital version, we tend to have this idea that we're sort of in our home and we're kind of alone and we're on a computer screen, so we're kind of on our own, right? But that's not true. It's only true like this because we don't have a way in which we can necessarily digitally connect how we can do on blockchain. In the physical world, we're protected by our social neighborhood, by people who are around. So if someone does something, there's someone next door, or there's a family, or there's other people around there as a framing that provides this kind of sort of, civil protection, as I would say. And to
Hmm.
me, blockchain represents this kind of digital layer of civil protection because everyone's interlinked with each other and verifies each other all the time.
How does the verification work? I think that's a question that people often ask. They're like, okay, what he said makes sense conceptually, but what does verification mean from that perspective? Like, me and you can have a conversation, and I have known that it's you because it's your email and it's your face, and you're talking to me, and I'm talking to you, and so we verify kind of human to human. But on a blockchain, like, how does that actually work?
Well, I mean, on the blockchain, so I guess sort of the simplest way to express it is obviously it's cryptographically secured and you sign it. right?
Mm.
And so the verification is essentially the signature, whether you sign it with a smart contract that you engage with on the blockchain, which is kind of like an application, if you will, right?
Yeah.
And through that signing, you verify it, right? Um, and so because you're the only one that knows the keys, you're the only person who can sign it, and therefore it's assumed that it is real, right? Which is very different from you logging in with a username password, which, yes, that was kind of one version of security, but it is not nearly as secure. Also, because it's in a centralized system, it can be hacked. And that's the other
Yep.
thing. As a network, blockchain is far more secure than any kind of centralized network out there, right? Not just because of the social engineering hack, but also from a sort of pure technical hack. It's much, much harder to do so. And a lot of people would say, oh, but people, like the Bitcoin was hacked or something. And here's the point: is it's not Bitcoin that was hacked. It's people who basically broke into people's wallets, usually through social engineering or other ways, and then stole the Bitcoin that was in their wallet. So it's akin to a physical bank robbery almost, but just in a digital construct, right? But because people don't understand how blockchain works, sometimes they think that it's the blockchain was hacked, but there's never been an instance where Bitcoin, for instance, or Ethereum was ever hacked, right? It's just someone who stole assets, through a personal hack that then basically sort of brought on vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I think it's a very important distinction for people listening. Like the social engineering piece and the individual assets were taken rather than the network, the blockchain was compromised. Um, so speaking of being compromised, oftentimes people will bring up quantum computing or AI or some of these other maybe quantum computing more than AI, but as a potential threat to like blockchain and the cryptographic security that is existing. Um, what are your, I don't know enough to have real thoughts on that other than to be like, okay, somebody said this. I have no way to verify if this is going to be a problem or not. But
Yeah.
it's so like, what are your thoughts on that?
So I don't want to oversimplify it because
Uh-huh.
obviously it's something to look into. But I think of quantum, sort of the threat of basically quantum sort of computing being able to sort of really uh, sort of decrypt and essentially sort of the risk that people talk about is, oh, quantum computing is basically going to sort of effectively be able to sort of uh, create a double spend problem in Bitcoin, in the sense that it can sort of duplicate Bitcoin because it can hack into the network, and it can do all sorts of stuff, and also sort of compromised blockchain. That makes the assumption that the network won't be quantum secure in the future, which people are working on. And so I see this a little bit as like the Y2K moment for obviously the entire industry, not just crypto. Anything that relates to cryptography, which includes national security as well, right?
Yes,
Not
yes,
just not
very
just
much so.
no, yeah, not just sort of sort of anything related to the crypto markets per se is all under threat. So I think so if I were to simply look at it from a social perspective, the stakes are so damn high that all the sort of post-quantum cryptography type of work will be resolved by that time, because it's just way too important for all sorts of reasons, right? And there's been quite a bit of progress already been made. So the stakes are high enough to do so. And at least for Bitcoin, we have about 2.4 to 2.5 trillion dollars. Sort of trillion-dollar reasons why people are going to spend money to try to protect that, right? And it will extend beyond that as it goes on. So that's the first point I would say. So we do think it gets solved. Because yes, there's a technological threat, that is true. But for every technological threat, there's a technological answer as well, if you look at historically that way, right? So that's kind of the first point. The second one is that the general consensus is, and I know some people say it's going to happen in the next year or two, but the general consensus is that it's about 10 plus years out, if that, right?
Mm.
So it's not like it's going to happen sort of overnight. And the very simple framing to think about this is, quantum, without trying to go too deep into this, quantum mechanics is inherently probabilistic in nature, right? And so, in order to get the kind of cryptographic sort of computing power where you can actually sort of solve and break the cryptography inherent in the new forms of crypto that we have today, you need to have a lot of basically qubits, right? But because it's probabilistic, and again, I'm simplifying this as simple as I can, I think, is that the more, they're all probability engines. They're all in these sort of states of superposition. So the more, and there's also basically the noise. So the more, the more qubits you have, actually, the more inherently unstable it becomes. And it's a little bit like predicting the weather, right? If you want to take a sort of classic sort of way to sort of explain it. So you can kind of say, yeah, look, the weather's getting this way, but sometimes it doesn't, right? Now that's fine if it's predicting the weather because we can make adjustments. But if you want to break code, that's not fine, right? Like
Yeah.
you need absolute precision to break code. I mean, you can say, yeah, I can break code like I'm sort of predicting the weather, but that's not going to get you a lot of good results, right? And that's kind of where we are, and that's kind of where it's going. And so the more qubits you have, the more randomly weather-like it becomes. Where again, we can kind of roughly guess where it's going, but we're not going to be able to get to the precise location, which is what cryptography requires. Right. And again, without going into the specific sort of technical aspects around how to make it more stable and the temperatures required to do that, which is basically sort of, sub-zero, so you're able to sort of keep it stable enough, which is why that the combination of factors also make it difficult on top of it. And maybe we can solve this technologically, but again, if I was to sort of go slightly philosophically, the inherent probabilistic nature of quantum mechanics, which is at the heart of it, is precisely also what makes it so difficult to sort of make it predictable because it's not meant to be predictable in that construct, right? It's meant to be
Mm.
so, right. And again, I don't want to oversimplify it. It's not as simple as that, but it's to say that basically we will solve for that because there's enough reasons to do so. And we're not nearly that as close as some doomsdayers are predicting to say, oh my goodness, it's going to happen in 2 or 3 years. Don't think so.
All right. Well, you heard it here, not first, but you heard it here anyways. Um, One of the things that came to mind with the weather prediction is like, well, you only need to be right once, and then the whole thing is comes crashing down. But but I like the philosophical points that you've been making kind of throughout the show so far in terms of the foundation of capitalism is property rights and kind of transferring that to the digital space. I think we as a society, at least Eric's opinion or Eric's kind of observations and conclusions is we've kind of lost a little bit of that responsibility of taking ownership of property, whether it's digital or like well, we can't with digital really, but with physical things, a lot of things have been given to other organizations. Like, okay, I'm not gonna remember to, for example, go to the grocery store because I've got Amazon Fresh that just sends it anyways, and I don't have to remember to do like a lot of things are being automated and taken off the sort of like the responsibility of the life that you are living. And so I wonder from your perspective if the same is kind of true for digital property rights, like because nobody generally speaking loosely, like people realize that their data is being sold off to advertisers and things like that. I think people are aware that that is a problem, but I don't know about then when blockchain comes back how that would work is like, oh yeah, people are willing to take on that responsibility of owning their own digital property. So I don't, do you have thoughts on that? Just like kind of
Yeah.
just
So,
observations and things. It's like I don't really know. I think the world is going it's strange times, I think we can all agree
so,
on, but
so, yeah. Let me just address that part. Then we can go into the broader construct of sort of, I guess, property rights, which includes digital property rights. So, generally speaking, I would say human behavior is around protecting something that's valuable. All right. So
mhm,
because we don't think our data is valuable because we don't know what it's worth, which is intentionally sort of put forward by the platforms, we give it away freely. It's kind of like, if you're illiterate back in the day, you were willingly working for nothing when we were still serfs and slaves because we didn't know, right? Or before we had the internet, rice farmers in China or elsewhere around the world would basically produce goods while they were sold off for literally 100 times margins, like literally, right?
mhm,
And why and how did that flatten out when people came to realize, oh, hold on a second, that product that I sell you for $1 is sold for $50 over there. I didn't know that. Wait a second. Okay, so this is the point, right? So you have to know its value first.
yeah,
And then when the value is known, the other thing is that, and it's publicly known as in the market, then what happens is third parties out there are able to then recognize, wait, hold on. you cost you $1 to make this, or you sell it for $1, and this guy is selling it for 100. Well, you know what? I'll buy it to you for 10, so I can sell it for 90. And that's the point of a market, right?
Yes.
And so
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
transparency, right? So it's not only about, hey, I get a fair price. It's the fact that a competitor can now come in and say, I'll offer you a fair price. That's where the market begins to happen, and that's where you have more fairness emerge. So what has to happen, and this is happening in blockchain, but it's not happening, of course, in Web2 platforms, is that there is no market for our data because inside Facebook and Apple and Amazon, that data is theirs and it's exclusively theirs. And there's no exchange of that data because it's not our data to begin with, right? So we so and the way that let's take advertising, which is a form of monetizing our attention. That's what it is, right? Our attention economy has value to the tune of 1.1 trillion dollars a year at least, right? Yeah, probably more in other ways, but just directly in terms of advertising. Well, just think about how that advertising works. Is it a marketplace? It's not a marketplace. Facebook decides how much you pay for this. You
Mhm.
put something in an interface, you say, I want to pay some ads, and they say they'll cost you $5. And you might be arguably accessing your social channel. Let's say you put this on YouTube and I want to basically buy it from YouTube. Are you negotiating with me about how much I should be paying for advertising? Not at all. It's the platform that algorithmically decides what is in the algorithm. It doesn't say what's to the benefit of Eric. It says what's to the benefit of the platform. It charges and ambient sort of creates whatever framing it thinks makes sense for, whatever network that's out there that benefits, Google, Facebook app, or whatever the platform benefit. And it doesn't really treat you as a actual market. So the platforms themselves are as anti-capitalist and as anti-markets as you can think of, right? Whereas if it was a true
Yeah.
marketplace, we'd actually have an exchange. We talk about the value. There'd be a marketplace effect where we say, okay, fine, the bid for this advertising for Eric is like, $10 and someone's willing to pay $20 for it, then you'll get the $20 one, right? Whereas that distribution, you have no idea how that's even distributed because it's not your data to begin with, right? So that's kind of what's happening in the Web 2 world. Now, but it's the same impact in the traditional world versus the digital world. What's a valuable digital property right? It's Bitcoin, right?
Hmm.
So obviously you care about owning that Bitcoin. You're
Yeah.
not just going to give it away to someone for nothing, right? Because you know it's valuable, right? And so because you know the value of Bitcoin, now you treasure it, and suddenly you care about how to protect it. Is it in the right custody? Do I check it, right? And in the physical world, it might be our house or it might be our car. Oh, this car is worth $20,000 or this house is worth 100,000 or $200,000, I'm going to care, right? So you have to know what it's worth. And so how do you know what it's worth? Outside of education and financial literacy, of course, there's the market. And if the market isn't there, then you can't know what it's worth, right?
Mm.
So in a truly capitalist environment, there's a market, and in the market, I can know what it's worth. So in the physical world, we have that because I want to buy a stock or I want to buy real estate. And in my neighborhood, I have a framing that says, okay, this house is worth 100,000. So that means I'm not going to sell my house for 10,000, obviously, right? And then
Yeah.
there's other factors we put forward. But if I don't know what that is, because I can't read, which is sort of, why, like there's a number of despotic nations out there, and, who specifically don't want their population to be too literate. Why? Because you can't control a nation of people who are, literate because then they have information. And if they have
Yep.
information, they can say, is that right? Is that not right? They start asking questions. That kind of complicated for to control society, for example, right? And so that's an example. So we had to go through these stages of knowledge and literacy and reading and information and that kind of stuff so that we can then create a world where we can then have an actual sort of property right in which we can understand our value, and then we understand, for instance, what this person makes money. So for instance, in markets, yeah, why can people be upset about what people make? Because they say, wait, you're making this much money while I'm making this much, but I'm doing the same thing. What's wrong about this? Is there a solution? Should I solve for it? That was a discourse we didn't even have when they didn't have that information, right? So
Mm.
so it boils down to basically the foundation of the value of why you would value your property, regardless of what property that might be, comes from the fact that it is valuable in relative sense to you, right? So that's kind of the framing. Now, there's another problem which we have in the world, which is that most people don't understand capitalism, and
Yes.
we live in a world that is capitalist, say America, for instance. However, most of the people are not in a capitalist economy, they are in a labor economy.
Yeah,
And
go
they're
on this more because this is a point that I make quite often. Like I did, like the US is not actually in a true capitalist system at the moment, and people blame that word for like issues without
okay.
understanding the kind of what act like the economy is very complex and there's lots of different aspects to it. People are like, oh, it's capitalism's fault. It's like, okay, let's take a step back, and I think you're going where I think that you're going. So yeah, I would just want to emphasize that. But yeah, keep going.
Yeah. So first, okay. So first of all, I would consider America fairly capitalist
Yes,
as a system. Yeah, yeah,
generally
yeah,
speaking,
exactly.
yes.
However, I would say the problem we have is more than say more observant in Europe than say it is in America. Is that
I would say just
um,
like there are
yeah,
aspects of it that make it the aspects that people have problems with are not the the fully like there's aspects that people have problems with that are not
yes.
in the capitalism like in that like the mold of
So
capitalism,
the
I
issue,
guess.
yeah, the issue that most people have with capitalism, especially if they're not capitalists themselves, or at least don't identify as that, is their perception of inequity and the
Yes,
inequity
yes,
that
yes,
is
yes.
created from capitalism, which we can get into, right?
Yeah.
But the foundation, so the point is that if you live in a capitalist society like America, but you don't live like a capitalist, as in you're not an investor and you don't basically have capital or you create capital, right? Meaning you have assets or that of the sort, then you basically there's a disconnect. And so if you look at America or just generally the world, owning capital as in owning assets has accelerated in value, and being in the labor economy basically has broadly actually become in sort of actual absolute money terms has actually declined. Now, there's many reasons behind that, but one of the core reasons, of course, is that money, which was marketed historically as a store of value, has lost that aspect of a store of value decades ago, right?
Hmm.
And and I think most people who don't study this might not realize that the US dollar money supply has more than tripled really since 2000, and I think it's 2008 or 9, right?
Yeah,
Ever
yeah,
since
yeah.
QE started getting action, right? And so they sort of applied essentially Keynesian economics without actually fiscally being responsible in terms of actually reducing that supply thereafter, right?
And
So
just
there's this other,
real quickly,
yeah,
the QE for those mentioning or for those listening that he just mentioned is quantitative easing. Um,
yes.
anyways, keep going.
Yes, yes, quantitative easing, correct. And the quantitative easing basically, obviously helped grease the economy and put money in the system, but as a result, it actually diluted the value of the money you own in your bank account. And therefore, if you had assets that were actually more scarce, say like real estate, right? Then actually that asset, because it can't be inflated, or Bitcoin as an example for a digital sort of scarce version of that, those assets have increased substantially over that same period as more money has been printed and more inflation effectively has been created as a result of that, right? And because people don't understand that, they blame essentially the capitalists for taking the money as it were, and as opposed to saying, well, actually, if you were a capitalist too, your hedge would basically be to take the money and invest it, and then basically you would have hedged yourself against the QE effect that took place with the kind of sort of money supply that basically sort of flooded into the system and that the world is frankly reeling from still at this moment in time, right? We're certainly in sort of unprecedented economic moments, and I don't know if you want to delve too deeply into this particular topic, but I think the issue is that we don't teach about money and we don't teach about capitalism in school, and so people don't understand it. And just for
Yeah.
context, so I grew up in Europe in the 70s and 80s, right? So that was a time when we still had Europe divided into the Eastern and Western Bloc, and when we still had the Soviet Union. And I saw what real communism looked like and what absolute socialism was like because my mom used to work at the Komische Oper on the eastern side of Berlin, and I would cross over. And the sort of, in the spirit of, I guess, sort of classic economics, like, the principle being, and the reason why sort of that socialist system collapsed, right, is because it is impossible from both a human sociological perspective and a market perspective to be able to control prices, because it means that I have to be able to assume that we're somehow all thinking the same and that we're all rational interactions, which in fact we're not as humans, right? So, I mean, just picture yourself walking into a supermarket. Is it predictable what you're going to buy and have for dinner? Sometimes, but
Yeah.
it's kind of like the weather, right?
Yeah.
You go in and then oh, this is this and maybe this price and oh, I feel like chicken. Oh, look at this beef. That looks interesting, right? And it's very random, right? But it's an illustration of us as humans where we're not predictable. Okay,
Hmm.
right? It's not predictable what we pay. Can you predict that Pokemon cards will be valuable? Right? Can you
Yeah.
predict that? Can you predict that we care about Picasso as an art? Or can we predict about NFTs or Bitcoin or the share price of Tesla or even something like, basically what, like GameStop or whatever that is? Or, why would Atherton, which is, obviously a super expensive area in Palo Alto, literally be more expensive 5 minutes away from Menlo, which is also pretty expensive, but not expensive for Atherton, right? Where I'm literally like, when I was living there, it's just one of those things where I observe, I was like, oh, I'm 5 minutes away and the price doubles. Wow. Right? Like and again, it's not rational, but we do this, right? And so you can't predict that. And so therefore you can't have a centrally controlled system that says this must be the price because we don't function this way. And then, what the Soviets used to do, they would have to basically create on a daily basis the price of milk and the price of product because they're centrally controlling it and saying, today the price of milk is this, right? But it's impossible to predict this. This is what the role of the markets is, right? And so capitalism solves for that because inherently capitalism is a way where you and I, as we make an exchange of something, basically trade in a value of something that we determine is fair. And then, there might be a consensus pricing that comes around, and there might be ways in which broadly the prices are sort of coming to an area where we can sort of agree to it but it's social, right? The pricing is social. For instance, if you knew that the price of milk in the supermarket is $5, you're not going to pay $10 somewhere else, right? The other person is not going to just get away with that, right? However, if he happens to be 500 miles away and here's the only supermarket, I might have to pay $10 for that milk because
Hmm.
of the premium of, well, either I don't know, or I realize that I have to go 500 miles away to get this kind of milk. So you know what? I'll pay double, right? Like, right. But again, it's worth it then for the person to do this because he knows I can now deliver the milk because it's a commercial reason to do so because we're motivated by that incentive, right? And I think people, because they don't understand it, and they judge the outcome for those who are capitalists because it is true that if you are a capitalist, you have broadly done better than someone who's been stuck in the labor economy,
Hmm.
working their ass off, and unfortunately not being able to sort of get the same benefits. And, historically, one could argue that your 401k or pension fund or whatever is supposed to invest on your behalf, but that's unfortunately a big scam because the money managers basically who deal with those are not incentivized to sort of do it in this way because they get their fees and whatever, and unfortunately, they haven't been able to sort of perform, so that people were able to sort of get the kind of hedge or value that's out there. So anyway, that's it's we're kind of going a little bit in the deep end here, but I guess the problem is that people don't understand capitalism, and we have to teach them about what that is and what it really means. Now, there's two notions around capitalism that I would consider is a feature of capitalism, which is what people find objectionable in many cases.
Hmm.
And one of them is the construct of equity and equality, right? So
Yes.
the construct being that it seems unfair that he has more money or that he was born into wealth and I'm not, and so we need to figure something out. And there is an argument towards about creating, like we do believe that you can make a fairer form of capitalism. That's true. However, a feature of capitalism is inequity, right?
Yes.
Because if you don't have inequity, then you don't have a drive and an incentive to work harder. If everyone's the same and is forced to be the same, then there's no motivation for someone to work harder, right? So you need to have an imbalance as well. And then the markets will create hopefully some kind of equilibrium through the competition that emerges. However, if I don't have a reason to work hard, because I can see that if I work harder, or I work better or smarter, then I get a better outcome, which would be unfair to the person who's not working harder, but he's doing the same kind of work, then there's no reason to do that. So there's always that impact. And the second, and so you need this levels of inequity in order for capitalism to work, which as social people, we also always rank each other. We're kind of doing stuff where we're trying to sort of judge each other as well socially. So we're kind of, it's a feature of ours. But I disagree with the notion, and this is where I think the translation of capitalism has gone wrong, that, it's about sort of, being greedy. Okay, so there's an
Hmm.
area there. That's what I object with, and I think we've gone wrong in this distinction, which is to say that, the origins of capitalism is that we can use the human incentives of us wanting to do better for ourselves as an engine for growth. That does not mean, though, that we do it at the expense of others. That's very different, right?
Yes,
And as
yes, yes.
humans, we don't. So this is where I object, where people sort of glorify, yes, capitalism is good, greed is good, and because we're all fighting sort of against each other, we get to better outcomes. That might work for some, but in normal social parlor, we call those psychopaths,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Right?
yeah.
And we see this in real life. For instance, if I make money, some people give to charity. If I do well, I invite friends for dinner. Do I invite friends for dinner and have a good time with them, and I'm being generous because I want something from them? No, right? So right, like, am I wanting to help my neighbors or my community because and it's not a moral argument. It's to say that we as humans, because we're social creatures and we're bound by social norms, we care about social credit. We want to basically be accepted members in society, and therefore we're not going to do stuff that is just scorched earth and take, 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 because if we do, we become pariahs of society, right? Now, and I think this is the part that I think people kind of sort of, I guess, sort of commingle to say that, hey, capitalists are, these greedy bastards, which is not true. There are, of course, outliers who
Hmm.
are greedy, but there's many cases of examples of very successful people who very happily give away their wealth, their money, their support, right? Whether it's the Bill Gates or the Warren Buffetts or whatever of the world, right? That do that. So I just want to sort of call that out where people misinterpret that, but it has to do a little bit with the narrative that some people out there are sort of, I think, misinterpreting the words of sort of the godfathers of capitalism, which are really John Locke and Adam Smith, right?
Hmm. Yes, yes,
Who
yes.
who who have very specifically pointed out, and he's known as the father of capitalism, that it's not at all costs, right? So John Locke's, for instance, specifically, and John Locke was the influence for Adam Smith, so it points out that, the labor and the fruits of our labor should be rewarded, should be ours, right? However, as long as there is a good in common with others, as in, we need to be able to share that, and that it should be distributed reasonably well, because I shouldn't take more than sort of I need, and this is really a competitive framework as well. And Adam Smith as well was also concerned around the fact that, essentially around monopolies, for instance, and sort of people just going sort of the psychopath way. So I just want to make a distinction here that capitalism doesn't mean you're a psychopath, right? And
Yeah.
unfortunately, sometimes we translate, and the people who are not in this go like get all like upset about that. And the other aspect that capitalism gets a lot of criticism on, which I think is also a feature, is volatility. Right?
Yeah.
So this is sensitive, but it is an important part because volatility is information. So, for instance, if something does bad pricing wise, it shows that there's a collapse in demand. Well, there's a reason there's a collapse in demand, right? If central organization artificially inflates the price of it, then I don't know, I don't have information as to what's going on. And it creates basically crises of another type that is unsustainable over the mid or long term, or creates false markets and therefore really wrong markets and wrong information. If a stock goes down, if a commodity goes down or up, it's information to me, right? And so when I go to like blockchain and look at tokens, that actually is another form of information, right? So if a Trump token happens to explode at that moment in time, we may all say, "My goodness, this is bad. What a grift and everything," which I won't comment on. However, the fact that the Trump token has gone up or down or moves a certain way is a sentiment analysis on Trump as a reputation and an analysis that comes from that volatility, right? And you can see how that reaction happens as well, because pricing is information, right? And then it gives you a way to sort of, tell you what to do with that information, right?
Hmm.
So volatility is a feature. If a business closes down because it can't be sustainable, there's a good reason for that probably, and should make way for business that can be sustainable, right?
Hmm.
Um, and and the other thing about volatility, I would say as well, if you look at, because we see average numbers, we don't see the true volatility that is inherent in our system. Well, by that I mean, if you were to count the number of people who lose their jobs every month and gain a new job every month, it's very volatile,
Yeah.
right? It's not like, oh, average 3% or 2.3%, it's all the same, right? Because to the person, he just lost his job, and millions of people lost their job, and millions of people somewhere else got employed, and it averages out to 2 or 3% unemployment. But for the people in those communities, it is absolutely not feeling like an averaging out, right? And if you think about the number of businesses that close and open on a monthly or on a weekly or even daily basis, it's going to be a zigzag curve. It's not going to be, oh, like gentle and stable and so on, right? So it's not so we don't live in a society that is essentially stable like this, right? We never have. It's just that because we don't observe, and it's kind of like and we don't see it. I have three young, well, not young anymore, but I have three kids. And when they were younger, I wouldn't really recognize how quickly they grew because I see them every day. But then when I start traveling and I come back a month later, sometimes I go on long trips, and it's like literally like, it's like I don't know, like you could tell the height difference, right? It's like, holy crap, what just happened here? It just grew. And it's kind of the same thing here, right? When you're inside the system, you don't observe the volatility. You don't observe the pricing because it's kind of there. It's slow, it's gradual, right? But if you zoom out and take the pricing, like what was the cost of milk 5 years ago versus today, for example, you go, wait, holy shit, what? Right? Like, so you have to zoom out as well to basically be able to observe what's really happening. And so I think that's really important.
Yeah. I think to your first point about the inequity, like people are capable of different things and are interested in different things. And to try and force people into one box of, no, you're all gonna work in this industry or whatever is like it robs people of kind of the purpose that they might feel or fulfillment that they might feel throughout their life. One and two, just like if one of these people hits a home run in some industry, then you also rob humanity of whatever good whatever the good fruits of their labor are. And then to your second point about Adam Smith and John Locke, like I had to go seek those out on my own when I was in like high school, college, and I think I would say everyone should at least be familiar with their writings and to some extent, maybe you don't have to read all of Wealth of Nations or whatever, but at least know what the general premises are and be familiar with them. As the same way you should be familiar with other kind of economic writings. Like I don't agree with what Karl Marx said, but you should know what he said. I think in just having that basis of a foundation for economics is like and understanding why people do what they do and why markets do what they do and all these things I think
Yeah.
is super important. And I want to jump a little bit because we talked capitalism and property rights and stuff, and it would be I would be not doing my job as a host if I did not kind of make the jump to Animoca and your company. And so your company, of course, all right, you open up the website, driving digital property rights to build the open metaverse. And so we talked a lot about digital property rights, but like, how did you get started with like, because I think when I was Googling, you started in what, 2014 is when this started? Do I have
Animoca
that?
brands. Yes, yes,
Yes.
that's right.
So
That's right.
so that's
Yes.
a long time ago in terms of that's a very early adopter of blockchain and kind of getting on that train in the Web3 and blockchain space. So what led you to start the company and then kind of talk through what it is that you guys do? And because you guys have a bunch of stuff listed under here, you got Web3 businesses, advisory services, like all sorts of things that are going on, um, projects, research, all sorts of stuff. So how did you get started on it? What made you take the jump to be an early adopter in this space, and then kind of go through what it is that you guys do?
Yeah. So first of all, we got into the blockchain space actually around late 2017, starting with NFTs because we were involved in really sort of the creation of CryptoKitties through a studio that we owned in Vancouver. So that's kind of how I guess that was sort of our origin story as to the space. But as to why we cared about decentralization and blockchain, I mean, I myself basically have been in the sort of internet space back in really sort of the 90s. I was in the pre-internet space with CompuServe in the 80s. So I'm kind of dating myself at this point, dialing in with like modems and acoustic couplers. Those were the days, shall we say, of the early days of that formation of the internet, or pre-internet, as it were. So we've seen some of these changes. But one of the big events that happened in 2012 that sort of indicated to us some of the horrors of the world that we live in today is, we were one of the biggest. So we we're a game developer in 2000, really in 2011. We started Animoca before it became Animoca Brands in 2014. And we're game developers, and we were actually one of the biggest ones up until 2012 on the App Store. And then Apple basically removed all of our apps one fateful morning. We had no idea why. They didn't tell us. The assumptions were made that we were deplatformed because they didn't like what we were doing. But it's not like someone gave us a call and said, "Hey, we don't like your business practices. Maybe you should change," because the rules weren't very clear. Because frankly, there weren't any rules in this area, other than so-called manipulating the App Store. But we didn't do that. What we did was and we think that's the reason um, we figured out, and this was the early days of the App Store, right? I mean, this is we figured out that if we were to launch an app every week, roughly, and cross-promote it, we would always be at the top of the charts. And at one point, we basically had 12 out of the top 20 apps. And if you remember, when you scroll down
Hmm.
the early iPhone, it went to the first 20, and then you had to go to the next 20, right? It was kind of
Yeah.
like so.
This
So
is like
it's
first iPod Touch, iPhone 1.
iPhone 1,
Yeah.
exactly, iPhone 1 generation. And so we figured out, hey, you want to be on the first page, right? Which is basically no different than being on the first billboard. How do we do that? Oh, it turns out that Apple measures the number of times you downloaded and used. Well, how do we do this? Oh, let's launch a calendar app. Let's launch a calculator app. Let's launch and this was the time when everyone was creating cool little apps. And we basically created an app factory, and we basically ended up making quite a bit of revenue because we did it through growth hacking. But the difference about growth hacking on the internet, on the open internet, which is really what the web that we were used to with open source and everything, where we can kind of play and grow and do whatever we wanted, this actually was inside the playground of a company called Apple that had their rules that they centrally controlled. And when they removed us, we then realized, oh, wait a second, this isn't actually open. I mean, this happened, by the way, with Facebook and Zynga, right? If for those of you who might remember, Zynga was big with Farmville. Farmville built
Yep.
themselves on top of on Facebook, and it became really big. And Facebook was like, wait a second, these guys are actually growing on our platform, and they could potentially become a competitor, right? And in the open version, a true open version, which is kind of what blockchain would enable, it's just it's fair game. But here, Facebook said, we don't like that. Change the rules, change the algorithms, created restrictions, increased costs, did everything. Basically did the equivalent of creating tariffs, but in a digital construct to Zynga. Almost put them out of business. That type of stuff, right? So we went from a very open internet in Web 1 to a very closed web internet to Web 2. And so when we saw blockchain technology, we said, wait a second, this is how we get back to the origins of the internet, which is open, and now in a way in which we can own our digital assets, thereby introducing digital property rights, which is to me the foundation of our freedoms, right? The way because we have physical property rights, we have freedoms. I mean, it's a famous George Washington quote, right? Um, that you can't have freedom without property rights. They
Hmm.
go hand in hand. And so if you want to have digital freedom, then we need to have digital property rights, right? And that was the foundation and formation as to the mission of Animoca Brands.
Very nice. So the pivot from apps to decentralization and then into kind of blockchain, there's like a 5 year kind of from when you guys got pulled off the App Store to blockchain adoption. How are you guys keeping the lights on in those 5 years?
So there was another, and I guess this is where the markets do sometimes are good. There was another company in the ecosystem that had Apple envy. It was called Google, right? And Google was like, well, they had this thing called Android Market that nobody was using because Android
Hmm.
was just not very big back then.
Is this
Um,
the predecessor to like the Google Play
that's right.
Store? Yeah, okay.
That's right. So it was called Android Market. And we weren't doing much on Android market because there's no revenue there, but in comparative back in 2012. But because we had no choice, we basically sort of went the Android way. And while we were not able to make as much revenue as we did with Apple in the first year or so, Google basically gained a lot of market share with Android. Samsung phones took off, right? And so we as a business were able to recover and had a couple of more hits afterwards. So that's kind of how we kept the lights on, right? But it was getting harder and harder because, of course, Similarly, when Google became more influential, in the beginning, we had a great relationship because we were actually one of the biggest app developers because they kind of needed our efforts. But then as time went on, not only did it become more competitive, also you had to basically build products and services that, maybe Google was going to promote more with new features and so forth, right? So which is kind of a classic typical grind. Um, and then we invested in more game studios and development and made more product. And during the process of that product development, that's kind of where and this is kind of maybe the lesson here is keep trying and building stuff and innovating. And then you won't know exactly what will happen, but then something magical will happen. And that's been sort of stuff that happens in the course of history of all of our development. Not only specifically in blockchain, where we were basically experimenting with blockchain technology, it being super, super early. And then suddenly CryptoKitties emerged and sort of, ground Ethereum to a halt back then, with $40 million of sort of, sales transactions. And that's when we said, oh, wait, it's kind of interesting. We should look at that and then open the pathway towards that. But even when you think about the days of how we got into mobile gaming, yeah, that course, that route was completely unpredictable. It happened because I had young children and they were babies and I was annoyed at having to carry around this thing called baby Einstein cards. I'm sure if you might
Yeah,
not know
I
what
know,
that
I
is.
know it. I
Do you know
know
what
what they
those
are.
are? Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, they're these ridiculous large cardboard cards where you're basically showing them, to your kid, and they were just photos, okay? And there's the photo of an elephant, and there's elephant written in the back because apparently you can't read. But anyway, you need to learn too. Because of course
Yeah,
the baby doesn't get to learn the writing, right? So you show the picture of the elephant, and then you say elephant and cat and like Apple or whatever that is, right? And so you went through this, and it would cost like $16 per card, right? And it was all about let's make your baby smarter, whatever, right? So anyway, so I was literally, and one stack was like 20 cards, and I was carrying around 200 at that point. And it was just really, and so can you imagine you get a kid, and then you basically can't, and then how many parents out there, want to have a nice sort of, like a lunch, without having to always deal with the kid all the time. But you don't want them to just, and back then mobile games wasn't a thing. But how can you give them something where you don't feel guilty as a parent so they can be educational rather than me trying to have a conversation with my wife while I'm flashing, these silly sort of flashcards, trying to sort of intellectually stimulate the growth of our child because as first time parents, we don't know any better, right? So that's
yeah.
kind of that's kind of the situation. And I said, you know what? I had this iPhone, this first generation. I had a screen that was very big, relatively speaking. So I talked to my dev team and I said, guys, can you just take these flashcards and images and just do this for me, please? And it didn't even have words, okay? I mean, sorry, it didn't even have voice, right? It was just images so that they could just like flip through them. I said, okay, sure, we could do that. It took a little bit of time to develop, not long, just a couple of weeks because it's pretty simple. Um, and then I was very happy. And most people thought it was stupid because why would you put, because the phone was expensive back then. Why would you put a multi-thousand-dollar device into the hands of a toddler who might chew it and break it or whatever, right? That was just not thought process. I was just wanting some peace, right? And so, and then I don't know, was it 1 month or two, whatever period later, the developer team around that came to me and says, "Hey, did you see?" It was called Baby Flashcards. Did you see sort of what happened with Baby Flashcards? And I have no idea because I'm not looking at the stats. I don't know. It's like downloaded like I don't know, like 10 million or 50 million. Like it was downloaded some crazy amount of time,
Wow.
right? And obviously, millions of other people thought it was a good idea, right? And we weren't monetizing; it was entirely free. And then we later, back then we didn't have in-app purchases, so it was like buy the paid version, try the free version type of thing, right? And and but because of the number of downloads, that gave us the inspiration to say, "Oh, interesting. This is something." And if you remember back in 2000, and I think this was 2008 or so, right? Moving into 2009, a lot of people didn't believe in the iPhone. They said,
Yes.
it's not going to work. Nokia was obviously poo-pooing all over it clearly, right? Sony Ericsson all said, Motorola, like, we're never going to use a phone like this. Or BlackBerry, you need your keyboard, right? Um, and from the outside, everyone's like, yeah, it's impractical, it's expensive, it's, like you wouldn't play games with it. And so, yeah, I mean, logically, might make sense, sounded logical at the time. But because we launched the Baby Flashcards app, we saw something. We saw traffic and real numbers and real users. And that's when we said, wait a second, there's something serious here. that I wouldn't have known if I didn't do that. And then we ended up making games because games had revenues, right? So the point of this is that you keep trying different things that follow your passion or interest. You have no idea where it's going to lead you. But if you continue to be inquisitive, it ends up landing you to a place where you then move into an area that's unexpected and wonderful.
Yeah. Do you, last kind of at least big sort of philosophical question for me is, given that the big companies control the data rights at the moment, and you are advocating for individual control of the data rights, are you concerned with, I don't want to go as so far as to say your own safety, but the legal battles and the battles that potentially come with taking a large source of revenue away from these giant conglomerates and international corporations that, like I don't know exactly what the ranking of Apple, Google, and Facebook is, but I imagine they're all in like the top 10 biggest companies in the world, if
Oh, they're
not.
trillions of dollars. Top,
Yeah, it's
definitely
like,
the top five and trillions of dollars
and
worth. Correct.
so what you are advocating for successfully is a big hit to their pocketbook. Does that concern you at all? Like, how have you had situations where you've had to kind of restructure how you say things, or like, because
No.
it's a big undertaking, that like that effort, and
Yeah.
so there will
So
be resistance, of course.
of course, there's resistance. However, we're fortunately most of us can still say things that we need to say at the end of the day. While there's some tragic cases where people are say things and unfortunately stuff happens to them, but of course we can't live in a world like that, and we have to sort of stand up for the rights we think are important. And I think most of us do that, so that's nice. And so we continue to stand for what that is. I think the perfect proxy for this to me is what's happening with digital assets. So, when people talk about digital property rights and is that really a thing compared to Apple, Facebook, Google trying to suppress it? Well, the perfect example to this is if you look at the value of all digital assets today, which is about 4.2 trillion, right? Between Bitcoin, Ethereum, various tokens out there, right? And they are our digital property, and they are the foundational frameworks in which we're able to sort of build this type of framework for digital freedom, self-custody of our assets, self-custody of our digital data, self-custody of our, basically digital value. And that to me, if it wasn't a thing, and if it was successfully suppressed, would not be worth 4.2 trillion. That was worth 2.5 trillion a year ago. That was worth 1 trillion years before, right? So why is there this continued accelerated growth and demand, which is to me the value representation of that is capitalist. And as I said, we look at capitalism as an indicator of money and attention, and the volatility and the price action inherent tells you that there's true demand, right? So you don't manufacture $4 trillion of value, in a decentralized fashion. There is true demand. Where's that
Yeah.
true demand coming from? What's the foundation of this? And the technology that is based on this is actually the ticket for being able to build and compose in these areas. And more people are flocking into it than ever before. There's about 500 million people in the world that own crypto today, right? That's not obviously it's not the whole world, but it's a big number, right?
You said half a billion
Um,
with a B?
500 million with a
Okay,
B,
that's
half a
good.
billion.
Good, good.
Yeah, it's 500 million, right? And that number is growing every single day, and especially under your new administration, it's definitely growing faster than before. But the point
Yeah.
simply being that this is an unstoppable train, right? And when there is something that is better for people at large, they tend to flock to it. Like for instance, the internet. People resisted the internet. Traditional companies, they didn't like the fact that it disrupted media, and the interface, was pretty clunky. The first websites, my goodness, it's slow and nasty and
They're not
whatever,
great.
right? Yeah, they're not great, and yet people still went to them because it offered them value, as unattractive it may have looked at, that they weren't able to get in the existing framework that they had, right? And so the internet grew as this unstoppable force from very humble beginnings to essentially everything, right? And when you look at open source as well, I grew up in an environment where open source was not a thing. Everything's like, well, can you really trust people writing code that you don't know somewhere around the world? And then you're going to use that code and build on top of it and share that code? Really? Or don't you want to give it to those 10 PhD experts that work here at Microsoft who could do the work for you? That was the framing, right? And
Yeah.
guess where we are today? Everyone uses open source because it turns out that millions of people sharing code is smarter than the 10 best PhD guys in the world, right? So so these are movements, right? It's not just about sort of, money and value and whatever, but the money and value comes because these movements are unstoppable. And so what we see here with decentralization and with, the changes of us having self-custody of your data, which happens and has value because you care about the value of your crypto. Like people wouldn't care about self-custody of our data, of our digital assets, if there wasn't something valuable to protect. Oh, guess what? Bitcoin's 115,000 US dollars. That's valuable to protect. Now I
Yeah.
care, right? Okay. So all of those people who own crypto care about crypto now. And so they care about the value of the digital assets. And sure, maybe they might only be speculating and maybe they don't really use it the way that, some other people would like to use it inside a game or an application, but they certainly care to protect it. And that's what you need, right? You know, and so and whatever controversy you have in America around gun ownership or other forms of property rights or the democratic institutions that you have, as long as you have enough people who cherish them, it doesn't have to be all of them. As long as you have enough people to cherish them, because it's important to them for whatever reasons it may be, it will be there. You just need to have enough of a force, and 500 million people is enough of a force.
Yeah.
So I don't think and the reason why they grow, and this is again why markets work so well, the reason why they grow is because it's better for them and therefore they switch. Like for all the critics around crypto, they're like, oh, a scam and this, whatever. Well, if it really is a scam, then why does it keep growing? Why do more people join? Why do people care about it? Like just again, look at the numbers, right? And of course there's scams. And when the internet grew, we had Nigerian princes and stuff happening of all sorts of stuff that sort of did silly stuff, which and spam. My goodness, the spam was unstoppable already back in the early days,
Oh,
right?
it's still
Um,
horrible.
it's still horrible,
It's
right?
just different now.
Yes, it's just different. But anyway, so you'll always have scams, but at the end of the day, they didn't stop the internet, right? Because and the growth of email and the growth of that, because it just ended up being broadly a better tool and more useful. And the same is true for ownership of our digital assets and what and crypto is the way that we understand it because it has value.
Yeah. I hate asking people to make predictions, but I'm going to ask you anyways because the people listening like predictions. Where do you see the adoption of blockchain technologies and Web3 and crypto like in the next, I don't know, 5 to 10 years? People have talked about using blockchain for voting on an election, like political elections and all sorts of different use cases. Where do you see the future holding for Web3 and blockchain and crypto as a whole and digital currency as a whole?
As a whole, I think we're going to see mass adoption in the next 2 years, as in we're
Yeah.
going to break a billion users plus, and it's going to basically and if you look at the chart of the internet growth in the sort of early 2000s, it kind of mimics that of blockchain adoption right now. And so what happens is the chart is moving up, and then suddenly it just shoots up like that. And I think in about 2 years' time, we're going to see that sort of progression. And I think personally, it's going to be driven by this category in which we're active in, known as altcoins, right? And the reason why I say altcoins, and I don't want to be cautious, as in this is not financial advice, and you need to take a look at the market and understand it. But the reason why I say it's altcoins is because altcoins to us are like the Facebooks and Googles and Amazons of this world, and Bitcoin is like gold, right? So when you look at the value of gold, it is the largest valuable asset as a commodity. Gold as a market cap is larger than Apple, Nvidia, or Facebook or Google. But if you take all of the companies that were created, over the last 20 years, their combined market caps, is way, way larger than the value of gold, right? So Bitcoin, I think, will be similar, as in that Bitcoin will always be the most valuable asset and continue to rise as the industry rises. However, it won't be the asset that will have the most growth overall because it's not the mass onboarder that it was in the beginning. Because basically the altcoin space represented through layer one, layer twos, or identity networks, or like metaverses or games. Those are the ones that are going to bring people into the ecosystem, and they start with some form of crypto, and then they might move to buy Bitcoin or other things, but basically they learn about that space, right? So the prediction to me is that I think we'll see sort of, a billion plus users in the next 2 years, that are basically owning crypto and doing stuff, which I personally I think is a pretty conservative estimate. But what it also means is that the certain asset prices in the space will also increase. And the reason I say this is because not just because of scarcity, but because of the demand that will come when more people come into it. It's like, if San Francisco or like Palo Alto prices go up because more people want to move there, or like New York or whatever, right? It's a simple supply and demand dynamic. And so that's going to have a pretty big impact in the value of crypto and tokens. So that means that over the next 5 to 10 years, Bitcoin should be worth a million plus, for instance. Not because it's only rising in value, but also because the number of people who want to own one full Bitcoin will see it as that ultimate status symbol, right? Kind of like your Beverly Hills address on crypto, as it were, right? And there's definitely more than 20 million millionaires in the world. And so they'll all want to own at least one Bitcoin is kind of one way to think of it. So we look at it also from that context, and of course everything surrounding around it as well, as everyone sort of, like ourselves, obviously making sure that tokens we're building in our ecosystem also rise to prominence. And that's obviously the competitive framework that we all exist in.
Yeah. Um, Tell the people where to, if they're interested in learning more about you or what your company and the projects that you guys got going on, tell the people where to find it.
So I think the easiest way to find information about us, if you follow me on X, it's YSIU. On Instagram, you can find me as well. On Instagram, I do more educational videos about money and crypto and what it means. So it's like clippings of my videos really. But for X is where I basically spend most of my time basically sort of posting stuff or sharing stuff I think is important. And of course, I do have a Medium blog that I don't write as much as I like to, just because I don't have as much time. But you can find more information about me and what we do. And of course, you can go to animalcobrands.com website. That's more corporate website. But we have a research handle as well, Animalco Research. That's good if you are a little bit more advanced in a topic, where we write some deep research about what we do in the space as well.
Very nice. Any last thoughts before we get you out of here?
No, I mean, I think one, so maybe I'll close it with this thought around what's going to happen. I think as we onboard billions of people into Web3, what's going to happen is we're not going to have just more capitalists. We're going to have better financial literacy more distributed around the world. And so our sort of conjecture is that blockchain is doing to financial literacy what the internet did to digital literacy.
Hmm.
And in the same way that knowledge and information distributed super fast, through the internet, like information at the speed of the internet, right? It's unstoppable. Value and value creation, basically is going to go at the speed of the internet because of blockchain. And you can see this when you look at how tokens form, how value forms. Even if the attention is only short, and maybe the value of that token is only for 5 minutes, or maybe one day, or a few months, or sometimes for longer periods, or sometimes for years, or sometimes forever, whatever that might be, right? That it happens super fast because the distribution and power of the network effects that come because of the fact that it is internet money or internet value basically forms so fast. And that is difficult for people to understand sometimes because they've never seen value formed this fast, but because it's value on the internet, the same way that information spreads, basically value spreads as well. And value can be created from things that always had value but couldn't be enumerated before. And to the critics, I would say intellectual property was an example of a virtual value that you couldn't own before until we had property rights for IP. And now today, IP is a $68 trillion market in terms of its value, which is larger which is about 8 to 10 times the value of gold, right? And that only happened over the last 100 years. So and again, that's entirely virtual, right? So we're going to see much more of that type of development and value formation as a result. And then, of course, we become more financially literate because all of the areas of our interest basically become property assets of a site. And I want to give you one example. We last a year and a half ago, we tokenized a Stradivarius. Now, Stradivarius is a rare instrument. It's worth millions of dollars. And most people won't care what that is, except if you're in that world. It did make some headlines. You can find it on Bloomberg and whatever. But who was interested? Well, it turns out that someone like my mom was interested because she's a musician, and she's like, "Oh, I could own a piece of a Stradivarius. That's kind of cool." And she doesn't know anything about money. I wouldn't get her to buy Bitcoin. She doesn't care about Tesla stock because she doesn't care. It's not her thing. But she does care about rare instruments of a Stradivarius because that's her world. And then you would learn about money because now you have an
Mm,
asset that's interesting. And now think about the path of how most of us learned about money. Some people are interested about money for money's sake. Sure. Those are the 1 percentile that work in Wall Street most of the time, right? But most of the world isn't like that. We learn about things because of points of passion of interest, right? So for instance, I'm a baker, but I run a shop. I learn about money because I ever run a business. I don't bake or have a passion for baking or for painting or for making music because I want to make money. I have a passion for it because I care about it. And then when the sustainability or areas around this, the money comes from that effect. And then I learn about business, right or wrong, right? And I make lessons this way, right? And so this to me is important because in the same way that we had to be digital literate 30 years ago up until we are today. Imagine if you don't have an Instagram page, if you don't have a website, if you're not on TikTok or whatever that is, or on YouTube, you'd be irrelevant, right?
yeah.
30 years ago, you didn't have to have that. You need to be digital literate. Well, in the future, you need to be financially literate because your competitor or your other person who does it is going to be financially literate and he's going to be able to do things with his assets that you can't. He's going to compound his wealth and grow his businesses or his opportunity because he knows what to do and you don't. So you have to have that skill. And with AI and stuff, that'll get easy, right? My point is just that you need to have financial literacy in the same way that we had digital literacy back in the earlier days. So if you're an artist, you must know about money, right? You must understand it, right? It's if you're a musician, you need to know about money. If you're a restaurateur, if you're whatever, Uber driver, you need to know about money. You can't just drive and say, "Here's my cash," and I put it in a savings account, which goes to zero. You have to understand, investing, and you have to be financially literate. I took great issue on, I think it was several years ago. I think it's Seth, whatever. I think it's Seth Goodwin or whatever. He's like a marketing expert, and he was very critical of NFTs when NFTs was all the rage. And by the way, NFTs is still a $600 million per month sales type of business. So it's certainly not gone. It's just the same hype. But very critical. It's like, oh, it's such a shame. Artists are more focused about making money than making art. Artists should focus on being great at the art and leave the art of making money, so to speak, to others and marketing and so on. The problem is, and this is what my mom experienced, is that if you're an artist and you only know how to make good art, the person who helps you make money has all the power.
Yep.
And then he takes advantage of you. And it's like that good old saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely every single time. And so if my mom understood money, she'd negotiate better terms, she'd have a fair outcome, right? Today, which musician makes money on Spotify? None. None at all, right? They have to make money in different ways, right? um, because Spotify basically takes away all the bargaining power from you because they have all the money, right?
Yeah.
Where so and they control the money, and there's multiple examples of this, right? So again, how do you make a fairer and better world? I think it comes down to making sure that everyone has more knowledge on financial literacy to negotiate better and more open terms. And blockchain is it's one of the superpowers is its transparency in the same way that I can see what happens on chain. For instance, I'm not going to pay more for something because I know what everyone else paid for it, right? All right. I know its value, for instance. And we had this for commodities and for trade and for things like e-commerce and what we saw with Alibaba and eBay and Amazon. And now we just have this for our digital time and our digital value. Right. So I think this is something that is going to fundamentally revolutionize the world. And I think it'll become better as a result of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to summarize and a great way to wrap this up. Well, sir, I appreciate your time. I learned a lot. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as well. For those listening, check the links out in the description. So all the stuff you mentioned earlier about his X and Instagram and the company website will be in the description as always. And we will see you guys next time. Peace.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you want to watch another episode like this one, click there. If you want to subscribe, click there.